It's very nice to be back here at UFO again. For those people who don't know me, I have been speaking for UFO since 1999, supporting UFO in the early days when Brian Dickerson was president and then Wendy Burnham, in all of their conferences and other, is that all right? And other meetings, so I'm quite an old hand with UFO, coming over from New Zealand quite regularly, and someone asked me this afternoon, how many times have you come over to Australia for UFO? And I couldn't remember because that's been quite a lot. Anyway, today I'm going to depart from what I would normally do. Normally overseas I speak about my contact experiences. In New Zealand I tend to speak more about sightings because of the climate there at the moment. It hasn't really opened up that much as other countries because, as you know, we haven't yet reached 5 million people. That's supposed to happen sometime next year. So I speak to spiritual groups and the odd group that also covers UFO interests. There used to be a lot of UFO groups in New Zealand going back into the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. But they've all kind of died away now, and people are busy on the internet looking at YouTube, etc. There is still one group that still covers quite a lot of UFO material, but I have a nationwide network called UFOCUS NZ. We don't hold meetings. We are an internet network, and we collect sightings from around the country, and we have staff around the country who go and investigate the sightings. Okay. So that's a bit about me. I've spoken in 8 countries now, so it's very, very interesting for me to see not only the differences in attitudes towards contact experiences and the kinds of experiences people have in, say, America, Scandinavia, UK, etc., Canada. They are quite different in many ways, and also the attitude towards sightings can vary from place to place as well. So today I'm going to talk about contact by design, why we should take UFO sightings seriously. Here's a few quotes here. These are from contact researchers worldwide. Sightings are done and dusted. It's all about contact now. Sightings are old school, old boys network, and outdated. Those of us who are aware know that sightings are irrelevant. Most of us know that only contact is relevant now. Why do you bother with sightings, Suzy? I thought you of all people would know they are not the least bit important anymore. So these are the kinds of comments I hear from a lot of contact researchers worldwide. Not all, of course, but there are some prominent contact researchers who have this attitude towards sightings as if it is a totally different entity. I'm quite fortunate in that I have had contact since childhood, and I've also had I'm in my 45th year of sighting investigation and research. So I've got a foot in both camps, and I can look at the interrelationship between them. And I think that's what a lot of people miss, is that the distinct interrelationship. So, sightings are just not about sightings. In the past, of course, we didn't have a textbook that told us how to go about sighting research. So way back decades ago, they were trying to in many ways to prove themselves to the scientific community, and many are still doing that. And so very much the nuts and bolts details were recorded, but very often those same researchers, like Maura here, know very well, and myself, what is going on behind the scenes in terms of many of those sightings lead to contact. Many of those sightings elicit memories of contact throughout life, and many of those sightings have a profound effect on a person's life that is not dissimilar at all from actual contact. So today I'm going to present just 3 sightings that also have the entity involved, the craft involved, and some form of communication. The second half of the program, I'll be talking about some of the sightings that occur in New Zealand around the times of seismic and volcanic activity. That's a very interesting part of our research, which we share with Chile and other countries where there are a lot of volcanic activity. And then there'll just be a little final bit where I'll talk about what's happening in the contact field at the moment, so that we don't completely walk away from that area. Okay, so for me, my wake-up call, as I have said at these meetings before, was in Hawke's Bay, New Zealand in 1975, aged 20. I had memories of contact as a child, but didn't relate them at the age of 20 to what was happening at that point in time. So just briefly, this particular event was very traumatic for me. I was travelling on a lonely country back road with my flatmate in a vehicle, and at some point it was a 2-hour journey through from southern Hawke's Bay up to the city of Hastings, and at some point we came down out of some hills and onto a 2.5k straight. We're just at the beginning of the straight when we saw lights down the hills, 2 bright white lights which we thought were either a helicopter or an agricultural aircraft flying towards us. They went out just like that, and so naturally you search, as many people who've experienced a sighting do, they search for the most logical answer or explanation at that moment. And my flatmate, who had a science degree, said it's either a helicopter or an aircraft that's turned away from us. We can no longer see the landing lights. But then all of a sudden, within a few seconds, the same lights appeared right next to us, adjacent to us on the hills above the hillside. And very bright, very white, not like landing lights, which you can look at. These were exceptionally bright. And just as we were beginning to argue about what that could be, they clicked off again and went back to their first position. They clicked off again and didn't reappear. So after a bit of panic and discussion, we felt safe. We felt reassured. Whatever it was had gone. But within seconds, my flatmate said, well, whatever it is, it's coming up behind us. And within a few seconds, this blazing oval of light, wider than a road, came over the top of our car. And to cut the story short, it lifted it off the road. I could feel the feeling in my stomach like you do when an aircraft leaves the tarmac. And he had lost consciousness and was no longer driving, of course. The car was stationary in the air, moving along underneath something. So something had locked onto us and lifted our car. And the next thing we knew, going from a bright sunny afternoon in Hawke's Bay with all the sheep stations and sheep in the paddocks and tree silhouettes on the hills, the next thing we knew was like a clapping sound in our consciousness or in our ears that woke us, and feeling the movement, flotation of the car, a slight wobble, and then it hit the ground, lights came on, engine came on, and we were at the far end of the straight, 2.5k straight, about to hit a one-way bridge, and it was dark. It was pitch black, and we'd lost roughly 90 minutes or more of time. When we got back to our flat, everyone said, where the hell have you been? And we could not answer. We had no explanation for it. Our mouths were dry, our hands were sweating, we felt sick, we felt exhausted but wired up, and nobody could get anything sensible out of it. It took weeks of me trying to get some information out of him about what he recalled, but he didn't want to talk about it because it had shaken his scientific paradigm, and he eventually left the flat. So it's a traumatic incident that happened, but many years later I came to know what took place. I'd had a horrific car accident 4 months beforehand. I really was not coping in my first year of teaching, and I'd been taken on board and given some implants for a balance problem and pain problems, and they told me that they couldn't fix me completely, but they could assist me to get through my life. And so I was being helped, and the last thing that I recalled being told was, we can't fix you completely and you won't remember any of this. We're very sorry, but for the time being, you must not know everything and you won't remember this part of it. You'll just remember the car coming down, and it'll be traumatic for a while. Okay, so let's look at part one. That's just the introduction. Voices of the witnesses. UFO sightings involving craft and entity. Often we ignore the voices of the witnesses, although I don't think it's quite like that now. I think more sighting investigators want to know what has happened for the person, and we are now starting in February doing a research project where we've got a psychologist who's now joined our team who's going to draw up a questionnaire, and we're going to approach a lot of our old witnesses right through to recent times and find out where they are, what's happened to them, whether they've recalled anything further or what has happened in their life in the interim. Have they had further sightings? Have they had memories? Where has it led them? And I think that's going to be a fairly interesting piece of research. So let's start with the first sighting, which is at a place called Mangawhai. Mangawhai is a beach area in Northland, north of Auckland, and this happened in 2012. So all of the sightings today are going to be relatively recent ones except one. And this was a sighting of a craft and an entity, and it was experienced by a New Zealand neuroscientist. Okay, so there he is actually standing out on the rock shelf that he was on at the time. I'm not allowed to identify him or give too many details, but he was out on that rock shelf. The tide was in a bit further than it is there, and he had to wade a bit at higher tide to get out to it. And now I'll just darken it up on Photoshop and you'll get more of an idea of what it was like for him at night. He was very familiar with this rock shelf. It was his way to de-stress after a busy week, and he'd go out fishing often late at night because it was quiet in summer and cool, and he just liked to be out there alone and enjoying nature around him. At some point he felt as if he was being watched, and he said to us, well, that's quite a common experience we all have. So he didn't take it too seriously. In fact, initially he didn't even turn around and look like most of us would do, just to check there's nothing there. But eventually it became so powerful that he turned around and he saw these two sets of green slits, which he ascertained had to be some sort of eyes by the way they were moving around. They were attached to something, or some kind of headpiece that was creating this look about it. Now, instead of being frightened, he just clicked into his scientific mode, and so he carried on fishing, and every now and again he would turn around and have a look, and he saw these eyes, if you can call them that, moving around the beach, and being familiar with the area, he knew they were on the pebble beach, and he knew that at that time of the tide they would be in a certain position, a certain distance from him, and he began calculating the elevation, how high they might be, because he knew where the beach would be, even in the dark. So he was doing some assessment of these eyes, and he said that when they looked towards him, they looked like that, but when obviously the head or whatever was holding these slits of light turned sideways, he saw more of a bulbous sort of shape with a glow to it. So his attention was piqued by this. So close up like that. So he decided that they were approximately 40 to 50 metres away, that the eye sockets, if you can call them that, were approximately 5 centimetres long and 1 to 2 centimetres wide. I've missed a word out. They were glowing fluorescent green-like irises, and he estimated that the head circumference could be 35 to 40 centimetres and the distance between both eyes around 2 to 3. So all of this was passing through his mind as he was looking at them. At some point he turned around and he saw these green things floating up, and then they kind of disappeared. So he knew that they were floating up that bank there, and after they'd got to the top there was a moment where there was nothing there, and then he saw those lights light up. So there was red, green and yellow and another colour which he doesn't recall, but he said there was another colour there, and there were two big white lights like the headlights of a truck or a vehicle. So then he began to think, well, maybe he was wrong, maybe that was someone with torches, and maybe there was a truck up there. But then he had to think, well, how did they get up the rough cliff face? They'd have to take some time to climb up there, whereas these things appeared to float quite quickly. And while he was thinking all of this, wondering whether there was a road up there and remembering that there wasn't, it was only rough terrain, not accessible by a vehicle, whatever this is started making a humming noise, all the lights brightened, it lifted up quite silently except for the vacuum cleaner-like hum, and it moved past him, past the rock face and directly out in front of him, and took on a different configuration. He could clearly see this odd shape, dark against the sky, and it took on an L configuration, so all the other lights went off and a new set appeared. It was about 300 metres out in front of him, and it stayed there, and he'd been quite calm throughout, but suddenly he felt, this is going on a bit long, what's going to happen next, what are they waiting for, and why am I still waiting here? So he packed up his fishing gear rather quickly and took off back across the beach and round the corner to where there was a small car park. And as he took off, before he rounded the corner, he turned around to see if it was moving, and it was still in the same place. So we actually went up to his holiday home, interviewed him. We went to the beach where this occurred and took a lot of photographs, and interviewed him at the beach where he pointed out certain things, and much of his assessment about where they probably were, etc., was very interesting once we saw the contour of the beach ourselves. So the outcomes for this man is that he's now has gone through like a psychic elevation, and he's become aware of anomalous lights and spirits. For example, his holiday home is a very old wooden homestead, two-storied. It's been there since settler days. It's extremely old. And one night when he was upstairs, he saw the spirit of a little girl. And so he made inquiries about the history of the house and found that this little girl, the history of the family, and that she had died upstairs in that room. So he's got this new awareness that has happened since this time. He's keenly interested in UFOs and the paranormal. His wife is a psychologist, and she said to me, if it wasn't I don't believe in this sort of thing, and if it wasn't my husband talking about it, I would be skeptical and dubious. But because I know my husband and I know how scientifically minded and very grounded he is, I have to believe him, and therefore I have to open myself up to other possibilities with other people. So you see, the change that can take place for a person after their sighting is not just the person who's had the sighting. It can affect the family, it can break families up, it can bind families together, it can affect friendships and workmates and the whole spectrum depending who you talk to. So this really, I have believed for decades now that sightings are a form of disclosure taking place all of the time, that they are not to be dismissed by contact researchers or anyone else. They are vitally important. And he's had a subsequent UFO sighting of a craft and entity, which he contacted me about a couple of years ago. He is now developing natural medicines. He's exploring alternative interests, but most significantly is he has a strong sense of purpose, and he's really looking for where he can put his energy into this subject and the whole gambit of subjects that surround the UFO field. Okay, so let's move on to the next one. This is a very interesting one. It happened at a beach called Muriwai Beach, which is on the west coast just north of Auckland City. Happened in 2014, and it was of a cigar-shaped object and entities. And this sighting was made by an advanced medic who's done a lot of papers and, you know, really efficient in her job. She's in her 40s, and a very down-to-earth, practical, wise person, ideal for this kind of job. Now, Muriwai Beach is a black sand beach. I'll show you that in a minute. And that means that if you go for a run at Muriwai, you really need to, in summer, to go on a wet sand, or your feet will just be incinerated by the black sand. But not only that, the black sand is very heavy, so this will have relevance in a minute as I go through this sighting. But As a child, my parents used to take my sister and I to Muriwai Beach and others similar. There's a one further south called Karekare. And we used to climb the sandhills, which were massive. And then one day, one of them collapsed on a little girl, buried her and suffocated her, so we weren't allowed to play on them anymore. But the point is that most people don't climb the sandhills anymore because they know how dangerous they are. And at certain parts of Muriwai Beach, the sandhills are very high. So this is a photoshopped into this image. That is actually the intersection, or one side of the intersection out in the country where this sighting occurred. And this medic was on her way to Muriwai Beach to go on a run. And she rounded a corner to this intersection and saw that there were 5 other cars stopped there. And they were all seemed to be looking up at the sky. Some had their windows down and people were looking up at the sky. So she stopped her car too and looked. And she saw the silvery white cigar or cylinder in the sky. No windows, tails, wings or anything else. And it was stationary. Now the interesting thing that she noticed, because as an advanced medic, one of the things she's very good at is observation, because when she's working in triaging in an accident or whatever, she has to be very observant as to who's got what wrong with them and who should be sent off in an ambulance first, etc. And she noticed that 4 of the cars had people looking at the object, and the 5th car had darkened windows with 2 men in very formally dressed, and they weren't watching this, they were watching everyone else in the cars. And she thought that that struck her as being a little abnormal. But it was being observed by people in several cars, and she remembers thinking to herself at the time, this is going to be massive news. So she was assuming that loads of people in the rural area would have seen it, that some of the people in the cars would go to the media, including herself, and it was going to be big news in New Zealand. But as she drove away, she immediately forgot the event. Okay, so that's just a map of Muriwai, see on the left, and it's a massively long beach here. Goes for miles, and usually when she went for her run to keep fit, she would enter through the beach forest reserve. There are park rangers there who can clock you in and clock you out. Generally during the day she's alone on the beach unless it's school holiday time, and she began her run heading northwest following that red line there for 2.5 k's. This is what Muriwai looks like. That's at the end where the sandhills aren't so high. But at low tide there's a huge expanse of sand, and then up to the left you've got tiers of heavy sand, iron sand hills there that sort of go back quite some way from the beach. They have a lot of tussock on them, and most people, as I said, avoid them. They get eaten away at the bottom as those, as those ones have been. Oh, I'm spoiling it for you. It gets eaten away here so that they're concaved underneath and they can collapse easily. Okay, so as she went along the beach, she normally would just run, take her cell phone, run for 2.5 k's, turn around, run back. But as she was running along, I've interviewed her a number of times and we've kept in touch on this. She said that the surroundings began to feel otherworldly, and she was not one to be into otherworldly things, but it had a strange feeling about it where she lost sense of time, she lost sense of distance, and she said she started to feel a little almost euphoric. So she was taking her cell phone out instead of having it in her pocket for safety reasons. She would take it out and was clicking off photos all over the place, which she wouldn't normally do. And she felt as if she'd been running for hours. And I think this is a reasonably good description of what we call the Oz factor in abduction and contact experiences, where people have this otherworldly feeling, they go into a semi-altered state, they're no longer quite in touch with reality, and at some point she saw mist gathering on a beach ahead. Now was immediately piqued my interest because a lot of experiencers and abductees talk about this mist that appears out of nowhere. And in my book I describe coming home from Hamilton City, across the plains and over the Kaimau Ranges to Tauranga late at night after a concert. And was pouring with rain and a lot of wind, so the rain was basically almost blowing horizontally at the car windows. But up ahead of us on the road, as we rounded a bend, we saw a massive mound of snowy white mist on the road, completely stationary, even though there was a high wind, just in a lump like cotton wool with blue and red lights within it. And we assumed that there was a traffic ops car there, that there'd been an accident or something. And eventually, to cut the story short, we saw a figure that told us to drive into the mist. We drove into the mist, and as we were driving in, we were in that Oz factor I've just described, where everything became otherworldly, and our vehicle was lifted off the road again by this round object on legs that somehow attached onto our car, not with a visible structure, but simply by some form of energy that lifted it off the road. So this mistiness is quite common. And she saw mist gathering on a beach ahead, which was very unlike the sea mist that you get at places like this where there's heavy surf. That's just my husband's Photoshop. Those figures look a tad tall and metallic, but they weren't metallic. They were just grey, shadowy figures that she recalls coming out of the mist. She remembers the seabirds had been wheeling all around her, calling and screeching, and suddenly they disappeared and fell silent. And she recalls figures coming out. She also recalled a figure that was standing down by the water, which was very much shorter, and she described that later on as like a Yoda-like figure because of its size, and she doesn't remember any more after that. So eventually when she came to, and I've put that in inverted commas because here's this fact that you have experienced something extraordinary, suddenly you lose consciousness or you lose your state of cognizance, and then you come to, or you wake up, or you come out of this state, and she found herself somewhere she would not normally go when she's there on a beach on her own, and that is right up in the steep sandhills, crouched down in a sandhill. And she felt this wonderful feeling of euphoria, but as she came to realise where she was, that she didn't know how she'd got there, she had no recollection of climbing up there, she knew it was dangerous and she was on her own, that quickly turned to panic. So she ran, slipping and sliding down the sandhills, and ran all the way back to the car park, to the car. And she had a feeling that she'd lost time. She was looking at the shadows, she looked at the car clock, she couldn't work anything out. She had this terrible feeling of fear. And as she drove out through the park ranger's box, they said to her, "Where have you been? We were starting to get worried about you. You've been running a long time." At that point, she began to recall the UFO sighting and wondered if this, what had happened to her, had some relevance to that. And immediately, you can imagine the scale of fear elevated really quickly. She called her husband, sobbing, and spoke to him. He said she was almost incoherent, sobbing and not knowing what had happened, and he drove to meet her and took her home. That's her way up high in the sandhills. Now, her figure doesn't look, if you look at the beach behind her there, oh, I've done it again. If you look up here, you can get some sense of how high up she was in the position where she found herself. Okay, so let's look at some of the outcomes for this person. We had a lot of communication after I had first interviewed her and talked to her. She waited a few days and scanned the internet, found us, decided she would talk to us. But in the interim and following for some weeks, she had some very strange things happen, which have happened to me and have happened to a lot of people who have experiences. Excuse me. And that was her house was watched. Now, this was not just her imagination or feeling paranoid about what had happened to her. She had other people in the vicinity of her neighbourhood telling her that her house has been watched, which is the same as what happened to me. The neighbours were verifying what we were seeing. Her car was being followed. She would see a white car, sometimes a dark black car at the end of her road, and with a couple of people in it, and when she went out the gate to go to work or whatever, it would follow along behind, and that was really freaking her out. Now, she's also a volunteer, both as a volunteer and a medic at her local fire station out in the country. So she went there one day, not long after this incident. She had her cell phone on her front seat with her pager, medical pager, and on the cell phone were some documents and photographs that she'd taken on the beach, etc., which she wanted to send to me, and some other things she'd written up, etc. These were all stored on her phone. So she went in and they had the usual practice, and they practiced some first aid stuff under her instruction, etc. And when she went out to her car, which was parked along the road under the trees, the cell phone was no longer on the front seat. Her pager was, but the car hadn't had windows smashed. It was still locked. So this is a very odd thing that also happens to people. Things go missing, and I know you may have heard of Robert Salas in the States. He's one of the whistleblowers over there, and he recently had the same thing happen to him. His car was broken into or entered and his briefcase taken, but the car was still locked. So this was really starting to scare her a bit, and she could recall, of course, that car sitting there at the site of the sighting with two men observing the witnesses and not observing the craft. So she's had a lot of paranormal experiences, seeing spirit people, experiencing precognition, seeing auras and colours around people, and a lot of things which are quite normal for experiencers, but which she had not previously experienced. She'd had memories of lights coming into her room at night, not being able to wake her husband because he was in such a deep sleep. That's another common one. And then not remembering anymore. Why would you go back to sleep when you're witnessing and experiencing something like that? It's not normal for you to roll over and go to sleep. So that kind of thing, the paranormal happening on a reasonably regular basis. So out in the area she lives in, and we're going to talk about this area a little bit further on, she'd had further sightings of not so much craft, but craft with a glow around them being chased by helicopters. She has had flashbacks of being on board a craft in a white room being taught things. And again, the last one there is the same as we had for the previous witness. This very powerful sense of purpose and the feeling, she said, that her head is stuffed with knowledge and information that she can't access, but she somehow knows it's there. Now, a lot of experiencers describe this where they've had downloads or they've had what I call thought seeds put into their heads that are not meant to open now. You can't access them. You are meant to have them come to the surface at the right time when you will be needing to use them. And so I've talked to her about this. She was getting quite anxious about it because she wanted to access what was there and wondered whether it would tell her exactly what had happened. But she can't access it, of course. And very often under regression, people still can't access those pockets of information. So we keep in touch every so often. And I think that this lady in the medical profession quite clearly, to me, and this is only my opinion, has something relevant and important to do in the future. We talk about earth changes and living in New Zealand as we do, seismic and volcanic activity. We had the Christchurch earthquakes where a lot of people lost their lives and were seriously injured. And I know, as I explain in the latter chapters of my book, the kinds of programs that the ETs are running to prepare us for these events. And it wouldn't at all surprise me if this lady was not a part of that, as is the neuroscientist, because people right across the board in all kinds of professions and all kinds of community jobs, right from remote villages through to the very sophisticated societies on our planet, are being prepared for these things. Okay, so we'll move on now to the last one, sighting, which is a longer one. Okay, now this is a really interesting sighting and contact event that took place near where I live. I live in the city of Tauranga. It's on the coast there, on the east coast, lovely white beaches and bush and lots of islands out off the coast, so very picturesque area. Lots of people like to go there on holiday at Christmas. But this happened between the coastal land, or the coast, and the Kaimai Ranges. The Kaimai Ranges run along the back of Tauranga. There's some lowland land, and you start to go up into the foothills. Then you've got very high ranges that cut us off from the western side of the North Island. And when you go over those ranges, then you go over into the Waikato to Hamilton and other places where, you know, it's the hub of dairy product in New Zealand. So in Tauranga, this happened out the back of Tauranga in a bush area, and there's also some forestry as you go back and up into the hills. Now it's quite significant that this happened on Māori land, so it was family-owned Māori land, which meant that it has multiple owners. Some pieces of land can have hundreds of joint owners. So we could not, even though we were told about the sighting and interviewed the guys within a couple of days, we could not go onto the property. And given the nature of the sighting, we really wanted to go on and look for ground markings and other kinds of signs of things happening that were obvious from what these guys described. But at that time, just within a day or so of interviewing them, the rain started, and we had rain for weeks with landslides and slips all over the place. And so we couldn't get up there, and we had to wait until the owners had been notified and unified and given permission for us to go onto the land with the two of the hunters and one of the hunters' mother, who was, the kaumatua of the group, so the elder representing the family. So there were a lot of formalities that we had to go through before we could even enter the property. Now there was a teenager, a 14-year-old, but because of some health problems this young man has, I'm not going to include him too much in the sighting. I'm just going to focus on the three adults who were in their 30s. Now, one of them, I'll call him Witness 1, was a very, very experienced hunter, and it was his family's land. He'd been on it since childhood. He could handle a gun like you'd handle automatically your knife and fork. He was a very, very careful hunter and well experienced in this. And, witness number 2 was also a hunter associated with the family, also had been on the property many times, could walk through the area that they went through almost blindfolded at night. They were so familiar with it. Witness 3 was, these two young guys were Māori. Witness 3 was Tongan, and he was a secondary school teacher from Auckland. He had never been hunting. He was the novice in the group. He'd been invited to go with them just for the experience, and he has said he will never do it again. If he visits Tauranga at all, it'll be in the daylight. Now, around about that time, for some weeks, there had been strange sightings happening in the bay. We call that the Bay of Plenty. And this is Tauranga Harbour here, and it's part of Tauranga Harbour. The harbour continues way up here, and it is bordered by a peninsula here, Mount Maunganui, which is the resort area, and then there's an island up here that closes in the sea to form the harbour. And around this whole area we'd had quite a few sightings taking place, and we'd had some reports, some which were quite clearly Chinese lanterns and others which were something different. So they were documented and put on a website, and but there was nothing really remarkable, just these odd sightings take place. Of course, the Skeptics Society were questioned, and they're in the latter part of the report there, saying that aliens wouldn't come down all the way here to play silly buggers with us. And so people were just seeing Chinese lanterns because if there are any ETs, they're not idiots, and why would they come here? Well, we had news for her eventually. Okay, so this is a Google Earth shot of where this took place. Now, this yellow line here is actually the race road on the farm or on the property. Now, I don't know if you know what a race road is. It's a road that goes through a farm which has gates on either side here and there, can connect other paddocks so that animals or whatever and vehicles can be moved up and down the road and through the farm quite easily. And that's actually 2.5 k's long, although it doesn't actually look it. And you can see that, oh, I've done it again. And you can see where they saw an orange light to start with, where they saw the entity and craft, and where the craft started searching for them. You can also see that all of this area here is thick forest, and up in this area, this Google Earth picture isn't taken at the time of the sighting, of course, so this area had been clear-felled. When they clear-fell the forestry, they cut down all the trees, everything is razed to the ground, and it's just dirt and stumps and a lot of rubbishy wood left lying around. So initially, the 4 guys were up on that hill behind the witness, and I've smudged his face to protect his identity. And they were up the top there. It was about 3 in the morning. They'd been out all night. There were lots of moorporks singing. You have them here, I presume. Moorporks singing at night in the bush, yes. So birds singing at night. They're about the only one in New Zealand that does sing at night, apart from a few swamp birds. And all was quite quiet. There was a light rain, and they were making their way down to the race road so that they could get back to their ute, which was parked in a paddock. Now, this is the guys here. This is a Photoshop image they did. So here's the guys sitting there with their gun, and they're looking out across the grassland, which is next to where the wooded or bush area is, and they saw this strange orange light, which was quite large. And it was on the inside of a hill, roughly 5 k's away. And it was big, and it was doing this strange thing, in that it was going up and in a square and down. And it kept doing that for some time. They were a bit curious about that. So here's what witnesses do. They first of all try to rationalise it. What is the logical answer to this? It doesn't quite fit in a box, so let's find a box that it can fit in, and then we'll feel better about it. So they looked at it and they thought, well, orange light, it's moving on the hillside, so it's a farm vehicle. And then they thought, well, hang on, it's early hours of the morning. Well, something must have gone wrong, or there's an animal that's sick they're looking after, but something's happening over there, so we'll just sit and we'll watch it for a while. They watched it for a while, and after a few minutes it started moving towards them across the landscape. At that point, they thought, right, well, we'll get out of here. We don't know what it is. They were even thinking, oh, maybe it's another hunter, but unless he's flying, it can't be another hunter, so let's discount that one. So they decided to go down as fast as they can into the tree area with the race road. So they observed that strange square movement, and when we went up there in daylight, of course, we could see that there was a bit of a valley down the hill there, and this object must have been moving at ground level for some reason and then going up and over and down the other side onto the farmland. Why, we don't know, but it was a very odd thing that they recalled. So here's witness 2, and he's standing in amongst the trees on a race road. Now, when we went up there, we which was a month or so later, we were hoping there might be some evidence of something, but after all the rains we'd had, no. But not only that, they had repaved the whole race road with crushed mussels, about a foot deep. So what happens is the crushed mussels, reject mussels, are put on the road, crushed up, and the smell is unbearable of rotting mussels, and you're walking, squishing in them almost up to your ankle. And that we had to do that, walk the 2.5 Ks with witness 1 and back, walk the 2.5 Ks with witness 2 and back, and then go back, take photos, footage, etc. of particular spots. So I don't want to see another mussel ever again, thank you very much. But it had destroyed whatever may have been on the ground, markings, as had the rain, and of course after the rain there was a massive growth of grass, so it was pretty impossible to find anything. But the witnesses found that they were being stalked by this light. And what they could see was 1 minute there'd be a massive orange glow coming in behind those pine trees there. So if you were a bird and you were looking down, you'd see little inroads into the trees, along the back of the trees. And that's where it was moving in, as if it was trying to get to them. This really gave them the creeps. And not only that, they would, at other times, it would change to massively bright white light, blinding. And they actually found that much more frightening. And then they would see evidence of what they called a red scanning light. So at the supermarket, and they check your stuff, they put that scanning light and it goes like that, okay, you know, that bright red light. Well, they described it as being similar to that. So it was coming out into a big hoop that they would see through the trees, and then they would see it recede back into the light. And then it would come right out in front in a half circle and recede back. That really terrified them, especially the 14-year-old, because they had no idea what that could be or whether it might eventually harm them. So they described their abject fear. This is like 3 tough guys. Well, not so much the Tongan guy from Auckland, but he was very fit and well built, and the other 2 were very agile and fit. And they said they linked arms with the boy at the end, and they were one facing one way, one the other, linking arms like that, and then they would run with their legs sideways, you know, sidestepping along, swiveling and looking around, so that everyone was looking in a direction and could warn if anything was around. That's how terrified they were. They'd fall over, they'd get back up, they'd hide against the bank when the light came in. And if you look on the right-hand side there was quite a bank. As you went along the race road, you came to a part where there was a bank with big 1.5 metre long fronds of ferns hanging down. And as the light came in through the trees, they would flatten themselves into the ferns, stay there until it moved out again, and then they'd keep going. So there was this terrific element of fear building up. And when we interviewed them separately, it was interesting to note that we interviewed them at the home of one of the witnesses, because that's where they would feel the most comfortable. And there were couches and things around the room, and we said, well, where would you like to sit while we talk to you? And interestingly, the 2 witnesses who were willing to be interviewed at that time, the Tongan man didn't want to be interviewed at that time, they chose the corner of the room. Now this is a classic PTSD thing. A lot of people with post-traumatic stress will choose to sit in a corner with their back to the corner, the wall, so they're protected and they can see everything. They can monitor the room in front of them with their back to the wall, and both of them chose to do that. Their faces would go white. Now these are Māori guys, they've got brown skin, but the undertone of their face would go white as we were talking. Their lips went purple. And at times they were under such stress that it was almost like they had lockjaw. They could hardly articulate. Their jaw would become like this, and they'd be talking through their teeth, really reliving it. And those tapes and the videos to listen to and watch are astonishing. We can't put them out there and reveal their identity, of course, but maybe one day they might agree to that. And when we interviewed witness 1 about this, he was at first quite traumatised by the memory of this. And he kept going, it had dark. And he'd say, it had dark. It had dark. And he just kept repeating himself because he had no way of explaining, and reliving the event was frightening. So he was describing that the light on the forehead was quite bright, and there seemed to be a shadow cast here. It wasn't that the entity perhaps had big black marks there, there was a shadow cast so that he couldn't see all of the features. This is his Photoshop drawing, which witness 3, the Samoan guy, also aligns with. That under the skin, it was quite translucent, and they could see this pink area like vein systems or something else going through the body. They were shining by now they were shining their spotlight on it to get a better look at it, and they said the moment they put the narrow beam on it, bright beam, it started swaying from side to side as if trying to move out of that beam or look around it, see them from beyond the beam. And the witness 1 seemed to have some communication taking place, because he said to witness 3, I've got to get over the fence, mate, I've got to get over there, I've got to talk to it, it's talking to me, it's talking to me. And he tried to climb the barbed wire fence. The other witness was trying to pull him back, so we have this chaotic situation again. This entity is just standing there. It didn't seem to be afraid of them. It wasn't scaring them, apart from its sudden appearance. And there was clearly some communication taking place, which we talked more about later on. But so he's trying to climb the fence, and witness 3 is grabbing his swan dry and pulling him back. He's all ripped up in the front, across the front of his jacket, is caught on the fence, and there's some moment of panic as to whether he's going to be stuck there and have to be disentangled. Finally pulled him off and said, come on mate, we've got to go, and they ran down the road following the others. As they came to gaps in the fences, in the hedge, they would duck through, shine the light. It was still there for a while, and then it disappeared. So they ran down the road to the car and sat in their ute for around 20 minutes. Lights out, too scared to start the car, just sitting there in the pitch black, quietly whispering to each other. And I've been through that one, sitting in a car with my ex-husband whispering what just happened. And so they were there for some time, confirming to each other. Did you see this? Yeah, mate, yeah, we saw that. Did you see this? Yeah, mate, we saw that. So there was a lot of confirmation and verification going on between them. And at some point they felt, well, we've got to get out of here. So they started up the car, and they described like wheeling down the road really fast, wheels spinning in the gravel, round the corner as fast as they can, out some distance to the main road that heads into Tauranga. And they contacted us soon after that. So we've been through that. And that's me standing in a paddock with witness 1 pointing to roughly where it was by the barbed wire fence there. So you can see that it's actually quite close to where he was. So we had a clinical psychologist who works in the background for UFOCUS NZ have a look at the interviews. She did not talk to them herself, but that's a pity. But she did view all of the video footage, and she says, in my opinion, the 3 interviewed individuals each displayed and reported behaviours indicative of or similar to post-traumatic stress. They were unable to clear their heads of the unpredictable and inexplicable experience. I believe these men witnessed a life-changing event, feared for their lives, and will remember the experience for the rest of their lives. So let's look at the outcomes for witness 1. That's the experienced hunter who tried to get over the fence to the entity. During conversation with him and his mother, he opened up to the fact that he has childhood memories of contact, and this was confirmed by his mother, who actually still has the drawings that he did as a child. of things coming and talking to him and taking him away. He was able to describe an incident when his first child was born and how a grey floated over the bed over the top of him and appeared to be looking down into his face and communicating with him. So although this was a traumatising event, because at the time they didn't know what it was, we later had this confirmation from the mother and family members that this guy had already experienced some things that nobody really knew what it was, what he was describing, but he could be quite detailed about it throughout his childhood and teenage years. He has family support and family interest in this. Not all witnesses are that lucky. Sometimes witnesses to sighting events are ostracised by family. It can break families up and break you up with your workmates, etc. He sought regression on the event, and when Mariana Flynn, your former president, was staying in my home, she did a regression with this guy. Some very interesting material came out which I can't reveal to you, but certainly he has had contact, and this was similar to what I described I experienced on that lonely road. This was a wake-up call. Unfortunately, for a while, he was called to speak at a little UFO group in Tauranga, and for a little while he became a little bit of a guru, which isn't such a good thing to put a witness through. I wouldn't have put the witness through that, but that's okay. He's not an egotistical sort of a guy. He's very grounded, and he's following a path of spiritual awakening now and really feels that this is what he's meant to be doing, that this event was meant to happen, and all that fear stuff is completely gone. That was just at the moment, at the time, and he avidly follows UFO sighting research and contact research. So it was a positive outcome for him. Witness 2, who had the son with him, had considerable fear and shock to overcome for some time due to his son's safety issues with his son. Of course, if you are quite traumatised and you are thinking that you're going to die, or your child might be taken away from you or whatever, that creates a terrible situation for you. It took him some time to come to terms with that. But now he's quite avidly follows the UFO sighting kind of interest. He's got a real increased environmental awareness that's come out of this. Protecting the forest birds, all of those environmental things that he's grown up with and took for granted have taken on a much clearer and more urgent meaning. Family has become even more central to his daily life because of the feeling that something could have happened to separate him and his son. And after all of this, he's worked through all of this, and he's now probably the least affected long term. Witness 3, who was the Tongan teacher, would not speak to us at first, but we had the gut feeling that because of his nature, I'd spoken to him on the phone, very quietly spoken and highly intelligent. Because of that, we actually felt that he might have a deeper insight into things that had happened, or a different take from those of the two hunters, simply because of his different profession. And it took about a month or so, a couple of months before he would agree to speak to us. He would not come down to Tauranga. We went up to Auckland to interview him. This is a man who's deeply religious, a very staunch Christian in the Tongan church in Auckland, as are all of his family, very devout Christian. So this really shook his religious paradigm. He was seeing something that perhaps his church would consider to be demonic, and he was extremely fearful of being exposed, which is one of the reasons he wouldn't talk to us originally. Even though I directed him to our website, etc., and assured him of the confidentiality protocols we work under, he really feared that we would go to the media and splash his name all over the place, which of course we would never do. But ultimately, some quite extraordinary things happened, and that is, he went underground. He wouldn't talk to anyone. He was really scared. If this has happened to me once, it's probably going to happen again, and what if it keeps happening to me? Am I somehow singled out? How does this fit in with my religious beliefs, and where do I go with this? What do I do? Who do I talk to? I can't talk to those crazy UFO people. I'll put my name in a paper. Can't talk to my family or the church ministers because they might think this is really bad. Where do I go with this? So it really affected him emotionally and psychologically. During Christmas, because this happened late in the year, he came to Australia to some of his family over here, and some of his family members flew with him. And he decided that by remaining silent, he was being dishonest. He felt he was being dishonest with his family. So he sat them all down over here and said, I have something to tell you. And he told them, he said there was stunned silence. He told them about the experience, and it turned out to be an extremely cathartic event, because he said there were several members of his family who then said, well, actually, and they then talked about how they had had some similar experiences, sightings, paranormal things happen, spirit people, etc. And they too had been afraid to talk about it to other family members because it was seen to be ungodly by the church. So is this a familial thing happening in this family? Are there, is there something about this particular family that has relevance to someone up there? Are they part of a greater picture? In the case of this young man, I would think so. So it was a very spiritual healing for all of the family. There was extreme family closeness after that. Trust and faith was restored not only in each other, but they did talk to ministers. So contact by design, why we should take sightings seriously. As I've said here before, when the public come to examine the sighting arena, the whole UFO arena, and that includes contact, do you think they're going to start with contact or sightings? It is my opinion, having a foot in both fields, that they will start with sightings. And we're already seeing, all the stuff coming out of the States, which I watch with some scepticism and a wait-and-see attitude. But we are seeing people become more interested in sightings, and Jamie mentioned more sighting reports coming in. And we have a wave action, which we've been tracking for many years, which is like a 7-year cycle for sightings, very common throughout the world. And we've been down in the dip, we're starting to come up. And when we come up here this time, when we reach that peak, in the middle of the 7-year cycle, we may find that we're inundated with sightings because of the new interest in the subject. So, in my opinion, this is me talking, sightings by the public provide us with a microscopic view of human reactions to alien life forms, technology and interactions, outside of and untainted by the much sensationalised contact arena and UFO community. So when you're talking to these people outside of the UFO field, not someone who's done a CE5 or a devotee of the UFO subject who's seen something. We're talking about members of the public who haven't necessarily considered this sort of thing before, and we're able to observe the psychological and sociological effect that it has on them, their family and friends, etc. So when this occurs on a much wider scale, we can be learning something from these events. And we need to be preparing with the right personnel in our groups such as this for such events, which are going to escalate, in my opinion. In my book, Chapter 19, Disclosure of a Different Kind, a meeting at an undersea base. So the different kind is disclosure from the ET's perspective. This occurred in 1980. And up the front of this meeting with 250 humans that I was part of, there was a human and a grey standing up the front, and I described what was happening. The humans proposed that in the future there will be much confusion and speculation as the realisation emerges that extraterrestrial races are actually here. Now, I often see on Facebook people saying, we're ready for disclosure, everyone's ready for disclosure. No, that's not the case. Not everybody is ready at all, as you can see from the experiences of these hunters and the different ways that they reacted to it and dealt with it, and the outcomes for each of them. No, we're not all ready. There's a lot of work to be done in the interim, and a lot more people who will have sightings, etc., before things really come to the fore and the truth is revealed. Sightings of their craft will increase, he stated, but significantly members of the public will begin to encounter not only the craft, but also glimpses of the occupants. And that's as has happened in these 3 sightings. This is a planned agenda, eventually creating a turning point whereby mankind will no longer be able to explain away all anomalous lights or objects in the sky. Other incidents and events will occur that will trigger human consciousness. True logic will eventually prevail and people will begin to accept the reality of extraterrestrial visitation. But I think we've got a way to go before then. So sightings are very important. They are like a microscopic view of human reactions. That's what we need to be aware of, the variety of human reactions, how it can go in either direction for some time and then it may change. And that's what we want to look at with the study we're doing next year into whether people's lives have changed and if so, in what way, because we have got a lot of very good sightings of these kinds in New Zealand. We don't know why we have such a rich content of sightings over there, but dating way back we have. And it's going to be interesting to talk to some of these people who've seen craft and entity or who've just seen craft, and let's talk to them about how it has affected them and get some information that may be useful. What they see, what they might see that we should be doing, what they might see as important in the future to assist people through these sightings and experiences. Okay, so let's make a start on part 2 now. Now part 2 is quite different from the first part. I'm not going to be looking so much at contact now, only one little snippet of that. Part 2 is about New Zealand UFO sightings associated with geophysical, magnetic, seismic and volcanic factors. And I'll just wait for people to stop talking because it's quite distracting when you're speaking. Okay, so as you know, New Zealand is known as the Shaky Isles, and we're sitting on numerous fault lines. And when the Christchurch earthquakes happened several years ago, they discovered that some of the fault lines that became evident we didn't even know about. And since that time, we're really tracking where the fault lines are going, and new ones are evolving all the time. So there's really a fracturing kind of effect happening underneath our country. So one of the groups worldwide that New Zealand networks with is CEFAA in Chile, and we exchange information with them about UFO sightings that occur around the time of volcanic eruptions and seismic activity. And there are a lot of other countries like Japan and Indonesia, etc., Italy, who have the same effect, where they see light configurations, etc., before and during and after natural events, which would indicate to us that someone other than us is observing what is happening to the tectonic plates on our planet. This is just a quick example before I get started of the kind of thing that can happen unexpectedly in New Zealand. We have something called liquefaction, which is like mud volcanoes or mud that just oozes out, like a slurry that oozes out of the ground unexpectedly in certain places. And this is up the Waimata Valley earlier this year and last year, where liquefaction came up in a farm, and it grew bigger and bigger, and it washed into the river there and created quite a bit of havoc there. The ground can be quite unstable. And when the Christchurch earthquakes occurred, one of the biggest problems in Christchurch was the amount of liquefaction that was so deep in some places. It was going up the walls of houses and people were wading through it. And the university students formed a group where they went out and they dug the mud and liquefaction out of people's houses and off their driveways, etc., and helped out. There were hundreds and hundreds of students activated all around Christchurch. Interestingly, the Waimata Valley was a very significant place for UFO sightings back in the 70s, and during the time of the Gisborne UFO flap, which happened 77 roughly through to 80, there were numerous sightings in the Waimata Valley. And I was living just north of the Waimata as the crow flies, and that's where I had some of my significant missing time experiences in a small seaside village where I was teaching called Te Araroa. So moving on. Also, I'm going to make reference throughout this to Bruce Cathie's grid system. Retired Captain Cathie, who had passed away several years ago, wrote a number of books, and he formulated what he called the global grid pattern, an electromagnetic grid where sightings often occurred at the intersections or on certain lines on that grid. Now, Brian Dickerson, and we discussed that a bit in the weekend, didn't we, Moira? You know, he was close to what the CIA told him was the correct formulas, mathematical formulas that he had based this on. They said he was that close. And although some people discount his grid system, certainly in New Zealand there have been a lot of sightings over the years on different places on the grid.
Suzy, I was in contact with Bruce Cathie. One of the publishers, for no reason, shredded all his
Yeah,
books.
that's right, yeah, exactly. So he was onto something, and he was pretty much silenced in many ways. So I'll make reference to that also. Excuse me. So this is the Cathie grid over New Zealand, anyway, that he first formulated in 1965. And you can see some circles there in the southern North Island where there were some sightings that occurred at that time on points of the grid, either on the line or at intersections. And certainly we've kept an eye on this over the years in terms of where sightings happen in New Zealand, and there are some very clear places on the grid where we have a lot of sightings taking place. But we also relate that to some of the seismic volcanic activity that has been happening in those same grid lines at that same time. So we're going to look at the Kaipara line. The Kaipara line goes across the Kaipara harbour, where Bruce Cathie had a sighting of a submerged UFO back in the late 60s when he was flying over in an NAC aircraft. And he approached the Navy, etc., and they said that no submarine could have got into there. It's a very shallow, muddy-bottomed kind of a harbour, and they said that there was nothing in there in the way of submarines. They just couldn't enter into the inlets there. So he believes that what he saw, which was a torpedo-like large object, was a USO submerged there in the shallow water, just resting quietly. Now, across this Kaipara area, there are some strange geophysical and energy anomalies that happen. So right across that line and that part of New Zealand, we get a lot of strange reports, not just of UFO sightings, but of quite unusual paranormal things in that area. And particularly around the Kaipara Harbour, there have been numerous reports coming in over the last, there was a batch of them about 5 years ago that came in for about a year. People ringing me up saying, look, there's strange lights out over the sea, there's strange lights over the harbour, and we're not talking about Chinese lanterns, it was something else. Now, in this area, there is a place called the Dome Valley. Now, the Dome Valley is well known for creepy things happening. People's cars break down. People have gone missing in the Dome Valley. We're talking about around 26 kilometres through a narrow valley area. There's quite a lot of bush in the area, and the road runs through this valley area, and then it opens up at the other end. The other interesting thing about this area is that just south of the Dome Valley, 5 kilometres or so south of the town of Warkworth, which is near where that arrow is, there's one of our communication bases with the big white balls, communication balls, satellite balls, that are monitoring communications, and we call that one, and the one that's in the South Island in the Blenheim Valley called Waihopai, we call them the American spy bases. That's not their real name. The government doesn't call them that, but most residents do. Okay, so also in the Dome Valley, there's just, we've interviewed some train drivers who drive through there who say that they almost draw straws for the night shift through there with the freight trains because they see blue shimmering electric blue light at times. So it may be that there's gases coming out of the ground, as there are in the Waimata Valley that I showed you before with the liquefaction. So there's all of this kind of thing happening on a daily basis in New Zealand. It's very unstable, and in general we have about 150 earthquakes a day. Most of them are so small that you don't feel them, but it's still significant that we've got such a high number of earthquakes taking place at any one time. On this occasion, in 2013, there was two significant nights, one after the other. One was the sighting of a strange blue light, and the next night a triangle. And this was by a resident right in the middle of the Dome Valley. That's a picture I took from the road outside her place, and you can see the series of hills goes back beyond those hills that you can see there. It's quite thick bush. And it would be difficult to walk up there. You'd probably have to hack your way up through that particular section of bush. This is actually the lady, and I've smudged her out there, and she's pointing up to where she first saw this black triangle appear. But you can see there, right behind her back veranda, you've got some thick, lush bush there, and that's not very tall there where she is there, but it's still difficult to get through. So, you know, this was a strange occurrence. So what happened was, on the first night, her husband had gone to bed, and she was sitting up watching television quite late, and suddenly the entire room was bathed with electric blue light. She ran outside, the whole hillside was bathed with electric blue light, and she saw this light become focused on one of the hill ridges up behind her house. And there seemed to be an explosion of some sort. So the first thing she thought of was, it's a meteorite, you know, it's come in, the blue light's shining, which is quite common, blue or green light, and it's hit the hillside. But she also entertained the idea that it could have been an aircraft, and she was waiting to see flames and maybe have to call emergency services. But the blue light disappeared and everything went quiet. Her husband got up, woken by the sound, and the next morning he tried to cut his way up through the bush but could not reach the ridge that this whatever came down on. So they were quite a little freaked out by this, wondering what this was. Was it a meteorite? Was it something else? They had also noticed that during that period of time that they were looking and wondering what had happened, two large lorries, like what you would have for military lorries, came chugging along the road past their place and stopped at the end of the straight, parallel or adjacent to the ridge where this thing came down. They were there for some time, and then they heard them leave. And they thought that was unusual because they're used to traffic just going through and heading south to Auckland. So the next day, same thing happens. Husband's gone to bed early, she sits up late, and she heard this roaring sound. And she described it as something that sounded like a Harrier jet. And so she thought, again, what is happening? There's an aircraft now, there's no blue light, the actual aircraft is coming in. So she ran outside and she saw, coming down all lit up over her property, an isosceles-shaped triangular craft, bracket aircraft. It had red rings in each corner of the triangle, which appeared to be dripping or dropping a red glowing material. Now, as to whether this is some kind of plasma, I don't know. She described it as looking like molten metal falling off the aircraft, but that couldn't be the case, or the whole thing would melt and there'd be nothing left of it. We have had this kind of report from New Zealanders before of seeing this molten glow dripping like molten metal. So she watched it come down and it circled around her property. I'll show you the map in just a moment. And underneath there were geometric fluorescent white strips underneath it, lighting up the underside of the aircraft or craft. It made a loud roaring noise. And we'll cover the next one in a minute. She was so intrigued by all of this that in a few days afterwards she painted the underside of what it looked like. The red glow was lighting up the bottom, as were those stripes which were fluorescent, giving the underside almost a pearly orange look. It may well have been a dark metallic colour, we don't know. That was just the effect of the light on it. So it came in on the left here, is when she first realised something was coming in. It was very, very slow, and it slowly went up and did a loop around near her balcony, went right around behind her house over a period of minutes, and then up to the trig station, trig up the top, the transmitter. So while it was moving, she said it was moving within a small area within the hillside. So this enormous craft was moving extremely slowly, and it was able to manoeuvre, just spin and turn as if on a pivot and go around. Not like an aircraft that would take time to bank and considerable distance to be able to bank around. Painfully slow, low, and turning on a pivot while she stood on the balcony and watched. That's the area of sky from her balcony where she was watching this taking place. And going back here is the hillside. It looks fairly low, but it's not. It's just the perspective. I've taken a photo up the back where it was cruising over it painfully slowly, as if it was, in her words, looking for something. So she began to tie in her mind the event the night before with the bright fluorescent light and something going bang on the hillside. And there she is holding up her painting roughly to show you roughly the size of what she was looking at up above in the sky. Now when this thing left after cruising around a while, it went up to that mast there, that's her television, up to that one. And I asked her to describe how big it looked. She said it looked like the size of a New Zealand telephone book, which is about this big. And she said when it ascended, it took off. In a split second, it went to the size of a bottle top and was gone. Now, the next day, they went to use, they've got a little shop at their house, and she went to use her fax. And the phone didn't seem to be working. The fax wouldn't work. Her husband took it apart and it was melted inside. And they got a tradesman in, electrician, to have a look, and their line or their electric lines, everything was burnt out for 5 kilometres into the nearest township. So they had to replace all of that, get that done. And it's interesting, as I said, to note that just south of there is the big communications station, which you can't see on Google Earth. That's all blacked out. So the outcomes for this lady was that she was extremely fearful and concerned for her safety. She was absolutely positive that the military was involved in this event and that they were going to come and get her because she'd witnessed it, and they would know she'd witnessed it, and they were going to take her away and do something terrible to her. So there was a lot of fear and trauma around this event. It's questionable as to whether it was an ET craft or one of ours, simply because of the very loud roaring noise it was making. However, you know, I have heard UFOs make sounds, not necessarily as loud as that though, but you know, just what came down in that area, we don't know. Her husband tried to get up there and couldn't get up to that ridge, so we don't know what was behind this. This one remains a complete mystery. This lady's privately interested now in UFO things, but is leaning more towards the conspiracy side of things. and she's not willing to speak publicly, unfortunately, because this would have been a really good one to go public with, but we have no expectation on witnesses to do that, of course. So once again, we have had a relevant sighting in this Bruce Cathie gridline area where other strange things happen. And I've also spoken to a witness who saw something rising. He was fishing and camping with his father and saw something rising out of the sea. And he thought it was a submarine surfacing, but it kept surfacing and it was huge. And it came up out of the water off the remote coast there and was surrounded by things which he described as looking like gnats. So they were smaller objects that came out of this larger object and were circling around it as it elevated out of the sea and moved off. So certainly there are a lot of strange things happening in that area. And as to whether this is to do with this electromagnetic grid line, to do with gases that may be rising out of the ground, but someone is keeping an eye on that area because we do get a prolific amount of sightings from there. So now let's look at the central plateau line. This is where our Lake Taupo is. Lake Taupo is about 26 kilometres long and I can't remember how many wide. It is so deep, they don't know how deep it is. It just keeps on going. They've never been able to find out how deep it is. And where I live, which is 2.5 hours drive from Taupo, there is water coming out in the spring in our paddock and in the neighbour's property that he's put a bore down, and the government people who came to look at the water source said it comes directly underground from Lake Taupo. So we can see that not only do we have these seismic and volcanic anomalies, but we've got this huge amount of water in New Zealand that is flowing underground in rivers and streams. It's absolutely prolific and everybody wants a bit of our water. We've got America and Canada and China in there taking water out of our Christchurch aquifers and selling it for a huge amount of money overseas and paying us virtually nothing. So you know, we really need to wake up in New Zealand and look up at our water source as something that's really precious. Now, the other factor about the central plateau line, apart from Lake Taupo, is that next to Lake Taupo, or not far from it, of course, we have the 3 central North Island volcanoes. Is that the sound going funny, is it? So we've got 3 volcanoes there that are, one is active, one just sits quiet and rumbles occasionally, and the other one is semi-active. So for a very long time we've been getting reports around that area, which again is on that grid line, that line across New Zealand, from that central plateau area around the time of volcanic and seismic activity. So let's have a little look at that. So what we have here is we have the Pacific plate going down underneath your Australian plate, and it's pushing New Zealand up down the Southern Alps here. They are rising up, and then all the fault lines go across to Christchurch and then on up through Wellington and up through the North Island, and then they go out here, off here. We've got Mount Taranaki here. We've got White Island, a volcano out to sea where I live, and off New Zealand going up the Kermadec Trench we have over 200 undersea active volcanoes. So we really are sitting on a bit of a time bomb. So let's look at this sighting associated with this central plateau line. There's near Lake Taupo, there's a place called Tongariro National Park, which is, of course, the national park that contains the 3 volcanoes and a lot of bushland, forestry land, and that's where all your ski resorts and small ski towns are, etc. And there's a small community where a lot of tourists go called National Park Village. And this happened near National Park Village in 2007. And it was sighted by a policeman and a hunter they were going out looking, tracking what sort of deer, etc., were coming into this area, what was visible out there at night on the tundra, and they saw a trapezium-shaped craft. So this is what the area looks like. That's Ngaruhoe there with the cap, the mist cap on it. And that rumbles occasionally and sometimes sends off a puff of steam. But not in this picture is Ruapehu, which is the really active volcano with the crater lake. So in the foreground there you can see it's quite scrubby. We call it, that area around there, the desert road, because the road south down the centre of the North Island goes through the desert road down onto the southern North Island and Wellington, and you go for quite some distance over this sort of rolling tundra, desolate landscape around the volcanoes. So they were out at night in a ute. They had a spotlight on top which they could turn on and off, and they were going over some difficult terrain, and they came across what they thought was a tent with a row of orange lights, which they thought were windows in the side of the tent with light showing through. And they thought, well, who on earth would be camped out here? You know, this is just ridiculous. And while they're thinking about it and looking at it, they stopped and it started to hum. They turned the spotlight on it and saw that it wasn't in fact a tent. It was an odd-shaped, trapezium-shaped craft with sloping sides and a large yellow area of glowing light on top. And it very smoothly took off and moved around, skirted around them, and very low off the ground, just above the ground, making a humming sound, and just went over the rise and disappeared. Now that sighting occurred just 10 days before the Mount Ruapehu Lahar on the 18th of March. And a lahar is when the crater lake starts to boil and you get all this ash and other molten mass coming up from inside the volcano, turns the crater lake from a bluey colour to black, and if there's some forceful activity underneath, it creates a lahar. So it breaks over the side of the volcano and runs at speed down the side of the mountains. There's emergency warnings, skiers get out of there smartly. They're usually pretty good at monitoring the activity and can predict when a lahar might take place, and there are warnings of different scales being put out. But there have been some incidents where the volcano has erupted right in front of people and people have had to get off the mountain very smartly. And it occurred 13 days before Mount Ngaruhoe rumbled on the 21st of March after 30 years of inactivity. So there was some quite significant activity going on underneath those three volcanoes, as well as Tongariro, at the time that this sighting took place. So once again, this research we do with other countries that are volcanic shows that there is a significant amount of activity prior to, during and after these events. And if it's not us, then it's got to be someone else coming in and having a look and noting what is taking place. New Zealand is probably quite a good place to study in this respect because we're far away from everyone else. We're quite remote down at the bottom of the planet, and we've got a very small population, whereas countries like Indonesia, etc., Italy that have volcanic activity are much more heavily populated, and things would be very visible. And so the Mount Ruapehu eruption in Lahar happened in March, just after the sighting, and there's an image of what it can look like. All that black stuff there is the Lahar running down the side of the mountain. And many years ago, decades ago, there was what we call a Tangiwai disaster, where the Lahar went down into the rivers and actually washed away a train, and there was a terrific loss of life. So when this happens, it's a big event, and obviously this was being monitored by someone. Now, on the 16th of March, after this sighting by the policeman and hunter, we had a report in Tauranga of a trapezium-shaped bright orange object observed moving slowly over the suburbs late at night. And it's interesting to note that the two ladies who reported this were two staunch Christian ladies coming home from a meeting, and late at night they'd had a meeting and supper, and they were standing outside their property, and they'd been standing there for some time. It was nice and warm, and they were chatting, and one of them looked up and said, "What on earth is that?" And they saw this thing. That's my husband's Photoshop version of it, which they approved, and it was moving over the suburbs of Tauranga and heading out towards sea. So really a lot of other people must have seen it, but of course, as may be the case in Australia, I don't know, getting New Zealanders to report is sometimes like pulling teeth out. So other people will have seen it, but we didn't receive those reports. But once again, we've got this witness problem where witnesses are affected by what they've seen. So we've got these two Christian ladies, one of whom said, "Wow, that's amazing," and the other one said, "No, no, no, it's demonic. This is terrible. You know, what are we going to do? We've seen something that just doesn't fit. This is awful." So even between those two very good friends, there was a discrepancy in how they approached it and how they dealt with it. And then on the 19th, a few days later, we got another report. Now, it's not strictly a trapezium shape. That's what the witness recalls, but it's close enough that it's got those sloping sides and orange lights. So it may be how they interpret it, or it may be a totally different sighting. We have to treat it as a totally different sighting because of the way they recall a shape. But given the sightings that had taken place and the very clear descriptions of it, we think it was likely to be the same object misinterpreted by the observer, who's down the bottom there as a stick figure looking shock and awe. So if we look at what was happening during February and March prior to these sightings, February and March, there were earthquakes right across the central North Island. Quite, everybody felt them. We're not talking about a little earthquake that was just a shudder. We're talking about good jolts. February and March, White Island, crater lake temperature rose rapidly. When that happens, we get worried. Now, White Island is out off the Bay of Plenty where I live, so if you continue that line across till you get to the other coast, White Island is just a little north of that line. And it's a very active volcano. It has a high crater border on one side and very low on the other. So the concern all the time with people who live up and down the coastline where I live is that if it should blow, if it should go over the crater edge and break away that crater wall and the sea flows in, then there's likely to be quite an eruption take place. And where I live, we've been told that if White Island blows and causes a tsunami, we've got 10 minutes to reach higher ground. Now, if you can imagine the elderly, mothers with children, people with disabilities, people working in factories, etc., who have to go 7, 8, 10 kilometres off the peninsula to get anywhere near high ground, it's going to be chaos. So they put warning signals, warning sirens all the way along the coastline, which cost hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars, and they tested them one day and they were a fizzer because hardly anyone could hear them. And they haven't been replaced because they've run out of money. So their next idea of supporting people who live in that area was to build wooden walkways across the marshland. So you've got the beach, you've got sandy land, that residential area and factories, and then you've got a bit of marshland, and then at the neck of the peninsula, then you've got high ground. So they've got all these walkways that you're supposed to run at speed for your life across and then climb up the hills. And in the meantime, you've got paddocks and a railway line to get over as well. So how is that ever going to work? Okay, so White Island is a concern to us. On February the 20th, we had Hauraki Gulf earthquakes. This was virtually unheard of because Hauraki Gulf is the harbour, basically, Waitemata Harbour area off Auckland, and we have got an enormous volcano sitting there very hot and simmering but not active, right in the harbour, right close to Auckland. Everywhere you look in Auckland, there's rangitoto sitting there. And we don't often get earthquakes in the Gulf, but this was happening at this time. What was I going to say to that? Forgotten. 18th of March, the Laha flows down over the crater edge at Ruapehu. 20th of March, there was a swarm of 100 earthquakes. 21st, seismic activity under Mount Narahoya, which sits quite quiet and dormant and rumbles occasionally. And then following that in April, there were numerous earthquake swarms that kept occurring for some time. So with these sightings that were occurring, we just received those 3 sightings, but it's significant that they were spaced out during this period, and to us at least, it's clear that someone's having a good look at what's happening and monitoring the activity. So now let's look at the Tauranga line, which is a little bit north, and that's where I live, by the sea. Where are we? Up here. So a little bit north of White Island, and this whole area is a terrific water catchment area. You've got thermal activity, so there are a lot of hot water pools that we can go to and sit in winter, and a lot of people talk about ley lines in the area. So we have huge amounts of water running out of the Kaimai Ranges, down across the lowlands and out to sea. Water seems to have a significance in terms of UFO sightings. We've had a lot of reports around New Zealand, very early report, I think it was 1890 something, of seeing this strange object hovering over a lake in New Zealand. So there's this big history of, I could tell you heaps of sightings about UFOs over water in New Zealand. I'll resist the urge. So I'm just going to talk briefly before we go on to this sighting about the road that I live in. I think I've got an image here we can look at. No, we'll just move on a bit. No, we'll go back. Okay, so where I live on a country road that goes from the sea, or almost the sea, all the way up, winds its way up and into the Kaimai Ranges. It's a very long country road, and I've lived there for 20-something years. And during that time, just in talking to neighbours and neighbourhood watch groups and just different rural community events, I've come across a number of people who've had UFO sightings up Esdale Road. My eldest son's friend, a girl he went to school with, was sitting up the top of the road in her house studying late at night in the 7th form, looked out her window, she didn't have her curtains shut, and there's a disc going past their house. And when I went to a barbecue at our neighbour across the road, he was talking to another neighbour, and I overheard him say, "And I went out there, you know, have a cup of tea because I couldn't sleep, and a bloody UFO went right past in front of me." So this whole area is being monitored for whatever reason. It's quite prolific. So we're going to have a look now at the last one. This is quite a long one. And this happened on that Tauranga line, and over the other side of the Kaimais is the city of Hamilton, March the 9th, and we're going back to 1995. And this was a silver sphere. And this involves my good friend and colleague, Graham Opie, who passed away in 2015. He was my right-hand man in UFOCUS NZ for 20 years. And the harbour pilot boat captain who brings in all the ships into the harbour, he was the other witness out at sea. So there's Graham. He was an ATC for 33 years, and he started out, how I met him was this event occurred, and I saw in a newspaper that an ATC at Hamilton Airport had had a sighting. And we'd already received one on that same day from the pilot master in Tauranga, the pilot boat. So I contacted Graham and asked him if I could interview him. He said yes, so I went over, met his family, interviewed him, and got on very well with him. kept in touch and eventually said, listen, would you like to be an aviation ATC consultant for us so we can find out things that we couldn't find out otherwise? And he said, I'll have to talk to my bosses first, Suzy. So he talked to CAA and they said, well, you can do what you like. So he said, yes, I'll do that for you. And then after a while, he became very involved with UFOCUS NZ, and I said to him, look, would you like to come out from behind the curtains and actually be an investigator with us and go public? And he had to think about that, talked to his family and said, yes, I will do that. So we're not sure, but we think he may be the first or only ATC and pilot to be working as a civilian UFO sighting investigator while still actively working as an ATC. In 2007 we had a conference in New Zealand and we showcased Graham as a result, and he earned the nickname of the credibility factor because whenever we were interviewed, he and I, they always wanted to interview him the most. I was just, inconsequential, because he was the ATC and pilot, and they would hang on his every word, and he did the job beautifully. So over the years, he was in a lot of documentaries and interviews, etc., and really worked to assist us in bringing this whole subject to public notice and credibility in New Zealand. So let's have a look at what was happening around this sighting. We have two volcanoes off our coast. Mare Island is directly out to sea from Tauranga, where I live. It's called Tuhua, and it's not active, but it rumbles. So there's been activity there in the past, but it's quite some time since it's been active. But it's sitting there. It's still connected, if you want to put it that way, to all the fault lines, etc. And in the future it could blow. And then further south we've got White Island, Tupuia or Whakaari, and that's very active, as I have said. So between those two volcanoes, we have had prolific amounts of sightings over the years, going right back to Brian Dickerson, Harvey Cook, and many of the other veteran UFO investigators in New Zealand were all aware of this very active area. And once again, often in association with events happening. Oh, that's just the catchment area. We'll miss that one. Okay, so I'm up Esdale Road, which I've told you about where I live, one night, and I'm ironing. Now, yes, I have contact and sometimes I get messages, and on this occasion it was like someone said to me, go outside. So I dropped my iron and took my dog and went outside. It was dark, and within a few seconds I sat on a log, rural property, and within a few seconds coming down the valley was an enormous apple green ball of light right out above the valley at eye level, going down. And as it went down, I watched it and I turned as it went down, following the line of the valley, and in my peripheral vision I saw something else and turned to look at that, and it was a jolly great big blazing red-orange ball with this sparkly tail behind it. Now, the first thing you're probably thinking about is meteor shower. But what I noticed, as you can see with that line near, is that it came in quite steeply and then it levelled off and it slowed right down, went horizontally and then down and very slowly down towards the ocean beyond the harbour, and the two were basically converging. So I don't think that was any meteor shower. So I wondered what was happening with this rendezvous out over the sea, incidentally just to the right of Mare Island, where this big sighting would occur some days later. So my friend, who lives on a peninsula jutting out below me into the harbour, and her family were cleaning up after a barbecue on the 3rd of March, and they saw, that's black and white, but that should actually be orange. She did it in pencil for me. And they saw what seemed to be like a flame in the sky that ascended from the sea out beyond Tauranga. Ascended from sea level and went up and took off, levelled off over the Kaimais in the Hamilton direction. And then Thursday the 9th of March, a few days later, at about 1:17 in the afternoon, the pilot boat captain is sitting out at sea with his mate. Now, the pilot boat captain is highly skilled in meteorology, as Graham was as an ATC. That was something they had to study in depth. And so he's sitting out there fishing, and they heard this bit of a noise, and they looked up and saw this big silver object in the daylight with a pinkish flaming tail, and the front of it seeming to be as if it was pushing the air in front of it with a bit of a halo of glow in front of it. And it was travelling horizontally, not very high above the sea, but well above them, of course. And it was coming over like this towards the Kaimai Ranges. And the interesting thing is that, which negates it being a meteorite of any kind, is that it came in like this over the sea, and then it rose up to go over the very high Kaimai Ranges and on to the Waikato. And about 2.5 minutes later in the control tower, Graham saw it flash past. So this article alerted me to the fact he'd had this sighting, and this was put into the Waikato newspaper. And Dr. Wayne Orchiston, the director of Carter Observatory in Wellington, of course, said it was a meteorite. And so the newspaper repeats this, and they put a few witnesses' names in. This school child saw it, these people saw it at an intersection, but it's all right, it's a meteorite. And I decided to talk to Graham about it. So this is the photograph Graham took from the control tower, and he talked in terms of arcs and degrees, which was right over my head. But he's put there that it went between arc 160 and 183, whatever that might mean, but that's the distance he was looking at, and he calculated by as an ATC. And he clearly saw it within that space. So he looked up, he was in the control tower with several ATCs, and he was doing some teaching with a young female ATC. And he said they'd all been looking out the window, down at their screens, out the window, down at their screens, and at the point in time when this occurred, all the ATs put their heads down except him, and he saw it flash past. It was approximately 17 kilometres south of the control tower, but clearly visible as described by the boat pilot. And using triangulation calculations, sorry, I just got distracted for a minute. Using triangulation from 3 witnesses, including himself and 3 other who saw it at around the same time, he was able to estimate its speed and its height, its elevation, its angle, the direction it was going in, etc. So he had a lot of information, and to cut a long story short, it was going much faster than a jet, a high-speed supersonic jet, but there was no, sound, breaking the sound barrier. And that's Graham's painting of it, which I have above my desk in my office now. And you can see how similar it is to what the boat pilot saw. So if we compare, the image up top left my husband did for me on Photoshop of what I saw, top right of what my friend and her family saw, bottom left, daytime sighting, bottom right, daytime sighting. I think it's safe to say that it was all the same object that was whizzing around Bay of Plenty skies for quite, a week or two. Coming in and out of the water between Mare Island and what's called Motiti Island, and going over the ranges and coming back. So that's its curving path from out by Mare Island, past Putney Rock, between Motiti and Putney Rock and Mare Island, where the guys were sitting fishing, and coming over towards Hamilton on a curving path, which is interesting. It wasn't necessarily a straight horizontal. It gained height, and then at one stage it just went and was gone. Now, having listened to Mr. Orchiston at Carter Observatory, we thought we'd make our own inquiries, and we went to Dr. Frank Bateson, who was a retired world-renowned astronomer, actually very well known in his time. He was quite elderly when we went to see him, but he was as sharp as a tack. And we sat down with him and talked to him about all of the details, the witnesses' details. He read what they'd written, etc. And he said this was not a meteorite. And we said, what do you think it was? And he said, I'm not going to go there. But it's not a meteorite. It wasn't a meteorite. It was something else. So let's look at what was happening around about that time in March. Just beforehand, February, earthquake swarms across East Cape, which is south of where we were. March and June, seismic activity under Mount Ruapehu. That's Mount Ruapehu there. It's a volcano. June, Mount Ruapehu spectacularly erupted, and there it is. That's the Chateau ski resort down the bottom there. They probably evacuated. It was quite an eruption, went on for some time, and then in August, September, a little later, further eruptions continued from Ruapehu right through to 1996. But it all started, that activity started back February, which was just days or a week or so before these sightings. So once again, can we make that link? We think that we can, that somebody is watching the activity that's taking place. We just don't know why or what they intend to do about it, or, you know, whatever. But there's definitely a monitoring of this activity on our planet. Okay, so let's have a little talk about Graham. Graham says, apart from that sighting, he'd never seen any other UFO. This was a photograph taken by the newspaper. They managed to capture a little Cessna or something up there looking like a UFO. This was for an article about Graham and I in the New Zealand Herald, and I've got a copy of that on my desk. Graham was not into the paranormal. He enjoyed hearing about it. He hadn't really experienced anything paranormal himself until he got ill with cancer. Now, we all talked him into having a past life regression with a regressionist in New Zealand, you know, just to see what would come out, because this was a very straight up and down man. You know, he was the epitome of professionalism. He had a very deep, cultured voice, and nobody questioned Graham, because when he spoke with real authority. That was the sort of person he was. He dotted his I's and he crossed his T's. And during this regression, two interesting things came out. One was that, I'm watching the time, one was that he'd had a past life as a gunslinger. He found that really hard to believe. And the other was that he'd been in a place where there was a white corridor, and that as he walked down the white corridor, he saw what we describe today as a grey. So the interesting thing is that a member of his family, when he was having the past life regression and discovering he'd been a gunslinger, which he didn't believe, he thought he must have imagined it, was travelling down the central North Island and called in at a second-hand store where she saw a statue of a cowboy on a horse and felt compelled to buy it for him, but was talked out of it by the person she was with. And really, if that's not confirmation that what he'd said was correct, that's just almost unbelievable that that could happen on the same day. But she was able to tell him what she'd seen, and that made sense to him. So, what have I got next? I'll go back a bit. Okay, so shortly, not long before his death, he came back from overseas where he'd been allowed to go for a short holiday. He was not on medication, so he was not hallucinating. They were running tests. He was in hospital, and He woke up in the early hours of the morning and was listening to the noises on the ward, listening to the nurses for quite some time, and then felt that feeling that someone was watching him. And he opened his eyes and saw a grey beside his bed. He said he rang me the next morning as early as possible, broke all his rules about never ringing anyone before 9:30 and rang me at 8 o'clock and told me what had happened, and said that he'd never experienced such overwhelming love and that he knew what he would be doing when he went to the other side. And he passed away within a couple of weeks after that. So I wanted to use this, and he gave me permission to talk about this, and I wanted to use this as a perfect example of how we can go through our entire life and not realise our origins or our purpose, and not realise that we've actually been doing that all our life. We've been leading up to our task. And as well as being a wonderful husband and father and ATC, he was also for 20 years a wonderful researcher in the UFO field, bringing great credibility to it and bringing a lot of professional people to look at the subject simply because of his own professionalism. And it was at that point in time he realised the relevance of it all. So to people who say, what am I supposed to do in life? I feel like I'm supposed to do something, but I don't know what it is. My advice is just carry on doing what you're doing and leading a good life, because if your little thought seed is going to open at some stage and give you some information, it's already programmed and it will do so. And you just wait patiently and be a good person and lead an interesting life until then. Okay, so the last little bit, which I'll be quick because we're right on time, are we? Okay. So part 3 is a brief section where I just wanted to look at what on earth is happening in the contact field. Now, I've just been in Brisbane with Cheryl Gottschall and Barry Taylor, and Cheryl and I are now doing podcasts together, and we're getting a little bit militant and a little bit controversial, because she's in her 44th year in the UFO field as both an experiencer and a sighting investigator researcher, and I'm in my 45th year. So we had this epiphany moment while talking together on Skype and decided that actually we've learnt quite a lot over the years and we should be doing more to share it. It's very difficult when you live in New Zealand to get speaking opportunities overseas, although I have now spoken in 8 countries, and some of those on multiple occasions. It's still very difficult because it's costly to fly people from New Zealand. So another way of getting these things out there, of course, and getting information is through podcasts, which a lot of people are doing. But Cheryl and I have grave concerns about a lot of the things that are happening in the wider UFO field, but particularly in the contact field. And when I was down in Brisbane, after my speech the day after, we had a brilliant discussion afternoon that was supposed to go for 2.5 hours, but went more like 3.5 hours. We limited it to 20 people, and it was fantastic because Cheryl and I raised a lot of issues and really got people talking about what is happening and what it means and where it's leading. So, I'm going to quote one of your well-known researchers here who's given me permission. And I was exchanging some emails with Keith about some sightings and things at one stage, and he was talking about things in the contact field and the wider UFO field, and he made this statement in his email. Some researchers, and he's talking about contact here, some researchers are creating the field rather than researching it. And I thought, man, that is a profoundly true sentence and statement. I couldn't have put it better. And I wrote back and said, can I use that, please? I'll credit you, Keith. And he said, by all means. So if we look at that, there's a lot of contact researchers out there who I believe create information or have a pet theory that they then start gathering information around that fits that theory. If it doesn't fit the theory, it's discarded. And I was talking to a gentleman earlier through the break about a researcher in the States who interviewed me and said, I'll put the interview on the website, and this is going to be great. I really love your material, and I've read your book, and want to get this out there. But you know, I've got this idea, and I want to ask you some questions. So our discussion took place, and then at the end of it, she asked me the same question maybe 8 or more times, rephrased in different ways, using different terminology, trying to elicit the answer from me that she wanted. So she was not listening to what my opinion or my thoughts as an experiencer. She had a theory that she wanted to prove, and when I didn't give her what she wanted, she said, okay, thank you, goodbye. Never went on the website, no further reference to it, because it didn't fit what she wanted to say. And she wanted to be saying something different to other researchers, because that gets noticed, you see. So without naming that person, this is exactly the sort of thing that experiencers are subjected to. How many times do you see contact researchers on the speaking schedules at conferences talking about our experiences? I've had that happen to me, where I've been at a conference and the contact researchers presented my material, but the conference was not interested in giving me the opportunity to present it. And often that material is morphed slightly, and many experiencers out there who are on a speaking circuit, as I am, in the States that I know, talk about this. They share material with a researcher who asks for an interview. When that is presented, it has slightly morphed. It no longer carries your voice, if I can put it that way. And this is a very interesting phenomenon that's taking place, and these people are billed as experts and leaders in the field. But as far as they're aware, they haven't had contact experiences, or certainly no memory of them, or no contact at all. So I think the time is coming when, and needs to come, when we hear more from the people who've had the experiences, because there's too much argy-bargy happening, and things being altered and changed. I see so much evidence of that with some people, and it has to stop, because what we end up with is a distorted version of events that the public then take as gospel. So I say to people, you know, the public will have to unlearn, and people in the UFO field may have to unlearn a lot of stuff. Beware of false narratives affecting the way people think, mistaken ways of thinking. And Cheryl calls this concreting. She's nicknamed this concreting, where if you repeat, if you're a researcher who repeats a theory often enough, it becomes gospel. It's like a water dripping, 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 and it doesn't matter how many times experiencers say to them, but look, we actually think a little differently, you know, can you listen to us? The drip doesn't stop, because I can't go back now and say, sorry, I was wrong, okay? Because sometimes there's just too much ego in play here. So we're getting false narratives, we're getting fake news out there a lot of the time. Let me say, there are some excellent researchers out there, but I've generally found that they're the ones who are experiencers as well, or have had experiences and sightings, and I'm thinking, or have closely aligned with them, like Kathleen Marden and others. So in my book I predict how, I'm not going to go into an explanation of the 3 waves now because there's no time, but I talk about 3 waves of souls that have incarnated on the planet. I was talking about this back in 2006, and I was told about it by the ETs from the age of 8 onwards, so I've got quite a lot of knowledge about this. And I know that around about this time, and perhaps over the next 5 to 10 years, there's going to be a huge amount of what I call the second wavers coming forward to talk about their experiences. So the second waivers are people generally in my age group, maybe from like the age of around 50 roughly right through to end of life or 100 years or whatever. Those are the second waivers, and they are, some of them are the parents of the third waivers. So this is all in my book, and I talk about it on my YouTube channel, Suzy Hansen channel, if you want to come up to speed with those, with that agenda. But we talked earlier on about the thought seeds coming to the fore in people, opening up. They've had them put into their consciousness on craft at some stage, and like Graham, they have no memory of contact, no memory of going on a craft, but at some stage this opens up and the information comes forward, and they know that they begin to remember things, having flashbacks, and go through the whole process that people like myself went through in our 20s and 30s, coming to terms with and assimilating our experiences. So when this happens, groups like this are going to be inundated with people wanting to talk about it, and you will need support systems in place. You will also need qualified therapists to work with people, both in perhaps counselling or if they want regression. Now, it's very important when you're dealing with people's minds and consciousness and memories that you are qualified to do so. I know Cheryl Gottschall is a clinical hypnotherapist. I know Brian Dickerson was trained by the New South Wales Police in forensic hypnotherapy. But there's a lot of people out there with no qualifications at all who've made a big name for themselves but are not qualified, and have led people to believe that they are. So, you know, if you want to go down that road of regression in the future, you have to ask, what is their qualification, where did they get it from, what is the institute, what year, and be sure that they know how to deal with these very vulnerable sides of humanity, which is our memories and our consciousness. This is Cheryl's phrase, New Age cringe. We're seeing a lot of New Age intrusion into the UFO field. Now, I'm not anti-New Age, but I do think that some of the New Age perceptions that are coming into the contact field in particular, and into the sightings as well, is diluting the really clear and well-documented information that's been documented and studied for a long time. It's really undermining it, and we hear things like people saying, I've had it said to me, you're a nuts and bolts experiencer because you've been on a 3D craft, but I don't have to do that because I just sit and shut my eyes and I go 5D and I'm right there in contact with them. So when you have something said to you like that and you're 64 and you've been at this for 64 years, it's quite alarming, it's hurtful, and it just disregards the kind of information that someone like I have of all the alien technology and how many scientists have come forward in different countries talking to me about what we are now trying to do that emulates that technology. So this is very validating for me and my information. So to have that kind of thing said, we're getting the same intrusion of the human bad habits that I mentioned earlier on, this competitiveness. So we end up not looking at the material, but at the competitiveness. We end up looking at the issues between two people when we should be focusing on what people have got to offer into the boiling pot that might be useful. Many current experiencers are disillusioned with the chaos in the contact field, and as a result, they are falling silent and joining activist or environmental groups, etc. I have a handful of experiencers worldwide that I'm very close to. We basically have telepathic contact in that I'll be typing an email to one and I'll get a message on my phone on Messenger from them saying, can we talk on Skype? And that's what I'm just typing. So we've got this connection going on. And many years ago on a craft, an ET showed me a hologram of the planet. And he showed me all these little silver dots, and slowly lines connected them up until the entire planet was covered with silver. And he said, this is what you experiencers will do one day. You'll start connecting with people who are like-minded, have the same frequency. And that's when you'll really start to feel supported and doing what you need to do. And I think we're just starting on that now. But it's very disappointing to find that many experiencers just don't want a bar of the whole contact field anymore. The egos, the circuses, the mantras, and the things that go on, both in front of and behind the scenes, and they're leaving it in droves. They don't care if they never speak again. And that's a big loss. That is a big, big loss. And they're just drifting off, and they're doing other things that they're passionate about, which is great. That might also be part of their task. But we are losing those solid voices that have been speaking for a long time. And I'll leave it at that. If you've got a question, that's fine.